On June 30th of this year, the Alberta government struck a aggression and complexity in schools action team. And the idea is that there's increased aggression in the schools against teachers. And so the government and the school boards and so on want to take action. And this appears to be part of the motivation for Alberta teachers in the course of their strike. They've been bringing attention to needing more resources, smaller classroom sizes, and so on. But we don't talk about aggression among by students against teachers very much. And so I'm going to talk to Jason Foster, who is a human resources and labor relations professor at the Athabasca University. So welcome to the interview, Jason.
Glad to be here.
I have heard this a lot anecdotally, and some of it is I've heard people talk about the problem with phones. That phones, thanks to social media platforms, have become little dopamine. They turn kids into dopamine addicts, and they're always on their phone, and they become very agitated when you take their phones away, that sort of thing. And there seems to be a bit of a breakdown, especially in the last few years, in the classroom. Teachers are saying, I'm worried. Apparently in 2023, the Alberta Teachers Association did a survey. 50% or more of teachers have faced aggression from students in the first 3 months of the school year. What's your take on all of this?
Well, I think this is part and parcel of a broader trend that we're seeing, right? I mean, this is obviously intimately linked to the broader issue in education of complexity in classrooms, right? Because we're dealing with more kids that have special needs, that have behavioral issues, and that's going to, have some impacts on aggression. But I also think the other thing that's happening here, and we see this not just in the schools, COVID did a lot of damage to a lot of us, right? In terms of our socialization, in terms of, it broke a lot of people, right? It's why we're seeing a lot more issues around student-involved people. And, we haven't been able to respond appropriately to that higher level of need. And I think the school system is kind of a microcosm of that kids are struggling, right? I know psychologists who tell me that, they're seeing kids with more sort of aggression issues and with other kinds of mental health issues. And they sort of trace it back to sort of COVID and then all the stresses of the last few years. And so, yeah, I think I think it's very much, I don't think anyone's done a study on it specifically, but I think it's clearly an issue. It's clearly a growing concern for teachers. And it certainly makes their job harder. And makes their working conditions more challenging, which is why I do think even though it didn't get talked about explicitly, it very much was in the mix during this whole teacher strike.
Well, yesterday, the after the back to work legislation had been tabled by Danielle Smith's UCP government, the premier actually wrote a letter to teachers, kind of I don't want to say an open letter, but anyway, all the teachers got a letter from the premier and talked about class size and complexity task force. Now, aggression was no longer part of the title of this. Wasn't discussed. Now it's class size and complexity. But this idea of teacher safety is more and more coming to the fore, and she acknowledged it in that letter. And from what you're hearing, what you're seeing, how big a problem is this? Are we seeing, is it a problem in the urban schools, not a problem in the rural schools? Try to get your hands
Yeah.
around it if you can.
Yeah, I mean, again, we haven't seen any sort of focused studies, and so we don't have any hard numbers in terms of both what's happening and how much worse it is. But in sort of understanding the issue. It's not just inner city schools, right? It's everywhere. It's rural schools. It's suburban schools. This is more an issue about how our children are doing psychologically and the level of supports that teachers are getting in the classroom. Because a lot of these kids, if there was that extra level of support, there was those extra resources that the teacher could call upon, a lot of those acts of aggression would be preempted because the kid would get the support that they need, in that classroom at the time, so they wouldn't get quite as frustrated or they wouldn't get quite as, as angry. And so I think the core of this, I think, comes to the fact that in the last few years, we haven't appropriately tackled this is a growing issue and figured out a way to solve the problem. by ensuring that there's more resources. And I do think that very much the teachers have been saying that for months in their ongoing, in what was their ongoing negotiations.
I'm hearing some skepticism from teachers about this task force. They think that it's a fig leaf for the government not doing anything, not putting any, bringing any more resources to the table. And the premier does have a bit of a reputation of, every time something comes up, she creates a panel and sends it out to consult, and it seems like almost a reflex political move on her part. But what's your take on it?
I'm kind of with the teachers on this one. I mean, I'm very skeptical that this is going to do much, and I do think the timing of it, its resurrection is very much, the timing on the same day as they introduced the back to work legislation really does seem like that was more targeted to the public as a PR kind of move as it was an actual a sincere attempt to fix the problem. I mean, if we look at the group that they set up in June, the Aggression and Complexity in Schools Action Team, which sounds strangely like a Marvel comic, group, but they got this range of things they could study, and certainly the 25 people who are on it are well-respected educators and education involved people, but they're not allowed to talk about funding, right? They can't talk about the education funding envelope. And so it's like, oh, great, you get to look at the problem, you get to try and recommend solutions, but those solutions don't include increasing the resources in the classroom. And so I think that's why teachers are rightfully a bit skeptical that this is for real. Is that that's one of the classic tricks that Danielle Smith does. She sets up these panels or these reviews, but then she narrows their scope so narrowly that they can't actually study the issue in an appropriate way. And I think this is an example of that.
So, if there were resources available, what might teachers or what resources might be made available to teachers in the classroom to address issues of greater aggression by students towards teachers?
Well, I think the single most important one is more educational assistance, right? Like the other educational professionals, right, who can be in the classroom physically with the teacher, right, to help work with those students, giving safe spaces, but safe and appropriate spaces for students who are struggling, with some emotion or some anger, giving them, a safe space that they can go to help cool down. I mean, I'm not talking the classic isolation rooms, but there are ways to do that in a way that is respectful, of the child, but also getting them out of the situation, right? But again, you can only do that with more people, helping and being in the classroom and working with it. And of course, smaller class sizes, as much as the premier doesn't want to talk about class sizes, if you have smaller classes, it's the teacher is more able to manage their classroom, right? With 40 kids, and if you've got 5 kids who have some aggression issues in a class of 40, that's going to be pretty hard to manage. If you have 3 kids in a class of 25, that might be more manageable for a teacher to be able to kind of nip things in the bud, or find that activity that kind of help keep them focused, or those are the other kinds of resources that they need, things that they can give them to occupy them, to keep their brains active, keep them calm. Yeah, I think obviously whatever the tools are very specific to the child, of course, but those we just need more of that, and so quite frankly that takes money, and in particular it takes additional educational professionals.
Now, maybe you can help me sort out a bit of confusion here. In June 30th, we have the Schools Aggression and Complexity in Schools Action Team. Yesterday, the premier indicated we now have a task force, the Class Size and Complexity Task Force. Is it the same thing with the new name, or are these two different groups that are somehow working parallel to each other?
My understanding, I mean, I could be wrong because it's been a pretty action-packed couple days, but my understanding of it is that they're different things. That the action team has already issued its preliminary report, hasn't been shared with the public yet, but they've done their first report, and this task force is new, and hasn't even been stood up yet. So while we've got two kind of overlapping committees doing the same work, is a bit confusing, but again, I think if we look to the fact that she timed that announcement for the same day as she invoked the notwithstanding clause, that might be our answer.
Might the premier, because she's legislated the teachers back to work. They're getting the offer that that was on the table basically from the government. They don't have any choice now. Uh, teachers said, premier said that there's enough, the cupboard is bare. There's not enough resources to pay teachers what they were asking for. Might this some resources put into the task force and new policies and something be a way for her to meet the middle ground? Or, I mean, we already talked about, is this just political cover? But is there any chance that this actually might be legitimate and improve things?
I mean, even if we were to give her the benefit of the doubt, right, and say that this is a legitimate effort for her to acknowledge that yes, there is a problem that we need to address, there's two issues with it. One is that if she really was serious about this issue, she could have proposed this months ago, right, before we got ourselves into a strike situation. And secondly, until she's prepared to talk about more money, what can this task force do? Right? They can recommend policy changes, they can recommend procedure changes, they can recommend, best practices. And I don't want to denigrate those things, those all can be important things. But if they can't talk about the elephant in the room, which is funding, they're not going to accomplish much. I mean, I'm reminded of, the Education Commission that the government set up in 2002 at the end of the teacher strike then, right? They set up this big commission to look at all sorts of factors and things in education, and they wrote this big report, a year later, kind of released this big report, and nothing really changed. Because at the end of the day, the government wasn't committed to putting, their money where their report was.
Well, this wouldn't be the first report that sat on a shelf and gathered dust. I think that's a common fate for reports. Jason, thank you very much for this. This is an ongoing issue. I know there's a lot of parents who are interested in this, because they're worried about their children in classrooms and class size and so on. So we'll be checking back with you in the future. Thank you very much for the interview.
My pleasure. Anytime.